What's up guys, Agent here again with another build video. Today we're going over the Warden healer. So not much has changed for Warden healers between Herostorm and Greymoor, just the potential addition of a new set to run, Roaring Opportunist. Other than that, not much has changed class-wise in terms of rebalancing. Greymoor was not advertised as a class balancing patch, so a lot of the strengths and weaknesses that a Warden healer had in Herostorm are pretty much carried over to Greymoor. They're still a very popular healer class, and you will commonly see them being used as a second healer in a lot of endgame trial groups. They have unique synergies, and a lot of their abilities do provide a lot of group benefit, so Warden healers have become quite popular and are among one of the stronger healer classes in the game right now. So just like the rest of our build videos, we will not be going over any sort of gear. That is reserved for the healer gear video, which should be popping up in the upper right hand corner right about now. So if you're interested in knowing what gear you should be running as a healer, go ahead and check out that video. This video will be talking strictly about the skills that we're going to be running, as well as a discussion on healing on ESO, how Warden healers are a little bit different from other classes, and the general philosophy behind healing in ESO. So let's go ahead and get started here with our skills. Starting off with our front bar, this is the Restoration staff line. We are running Illustrious Healing. This is going to be one of our primary heal over time abilities, or HUTs. Then we have Combat Prayer, which acts as a burst heal along with providing the minor Berserk buff. Then we have Enchanted Growth, which also acts as an AoE burst heal and grants minor intellect and endurance, which increases magic and stamina regen by 10% for 20 seconds, so really nice for DPS sustain. Then you have Energy Orb, which is one of the strongest heals in the game in terms of raw healing done per second. It also provides a healing combustion synergy, which returns magicka or stamina back, allowing your DPS to basically sustain their rotation a little bit easier. Then we have a flex spot here, and I'm running Overflowing Altar for the minor lifesteal. A minor lifesteal does proc any sort of set effects that require you to heal an ally, as long as you are the source of the minor lifesteal. So it's really useful to help proc things like Symphony of Blades or Sentinel Rkugamz. Plus, you also get the Blood Feast synergy, which is nice as an emergency burst heal in certain scenarios. And for ultimate, this is another flex spot here, but we are running Enchanted Forest here. This is really nice as an emergency burst heal. It's a very cheap ultimate at 90 ultimate, so it's really quick to get up, especially if you happen to get the additional 20 ultimate after you use it, essentially dropping the cost down to 70 ultimate if you're essentially spamming this. This is really powerful in terms of raw healing potential just for the amount of ultimate that you're spending on this. Then on our back bar, this is the Destro staff bar. We have Budding Seeds. You can run either morph of this ability, so you have Budding Seeds and Corrupting Pollen. Both of them are useful for their own different reasons. So Corrupting Pollen is useful because you don't have to cast it a second time once the Harvest Energy is used up. So the Harvest Energy can only be used once per cast. So with Budding Seeds, if somebody uses the Harvest Energy, you'd have to hit Budding Seeds a second time in order to activate the secondary effect, and then recast it, versus Corrupting Pollen, where you just have to recast Corrupting Pollen. So in terms of giving out synergies faster, Corrupting Pollen is better, but in terms of just passive healing, Budding Seeds is going to be stronger because the fields does have a small hot associated with it while it is blooming. So it's kind of up to you which one you want to go for. I personally like Budding Seed just because I like to layer down my hots, but if you are more concerned about getting more synergies out to your stamina DPS users to help with Lakeshi's uptime, then you would want to run Corrupting Pollen instead. Then we have Blockade of Storms for the off-balance uptime, as well as to help proc our enchant, whatever that enchant might be, on our back bar. Vector Infection for the minor vulnerability uptime. Then we have Expansive Frost Cloak for the major resolve. It's pretty wide radius, 28 meters, so basically hits everybody who's within range of you, if you're on something like Worm or Hircine, for example. Major resolve is a pretty strong resistance buff, so it does help out overall group survivability. Then we have Elemental Drain for the minor magicka steal and the major breach. Now, only one healer will need to run Elemental Drain usually, so if your other healer is running Elemental Drain, then you can swap this out for another ability. So this is another flex spot here on the back bar that you can kind of swap out if you do not need to run Elemental Drain. Then our main ultimate is going to be Aggressive Warhorn for the major force buff. Now, in terms of other abilities you're going to want to have on hand, there are a couple of them. First one is going to be Blue Betty if you need additional sustain. So this does return magicka back. It also has a purge every 5 seconds for 1 negative effect, including when you initially cast it. So Blue Betty is going to be useful if you need to sustain. I personally have found that as a Warden healer, you don't necessarily need to run Blue Betty to sustain, but it is nice to have this in the back pocket just in case you do need it. Then you have Deceptive Predator for the Major Expedition buff, which is going to be useful in certain fights. You also get Minor Evasion while it's slotted, so you get a little bit of additional survivability against AoE attacks, which can be very beneficial because a lot of damage you will be taking in Trials tends to fall under this AoE attacks. Under the Green Balance line, these 3 skills are all generally useful in their own and niche scenarios. Living Vines, both Morph Leeching Vines and Living Trellis, will apply Leeching Vine applies minor lifesteal if somebody damages whoever it is you hit. Living Trellis heals once the vines end. Both of them, the effect basically is if the target takes damage, they also get a heal. So basically acts as sort of damage negation, so to speak, which isn't terrible. The problem is aiming it is kind of tricky. It only applies to one person, so I personally found it to be a little bit inconsistent and unreliable, so I personally don't run it as a Warden healer. Then you have Lotus Flower. You're going to typically be using the Lotus Blossom morph, but either of them is fine. This just returns health to one person when you're doing light attacks or heavy attacks, which can be useful as a passive heal because you should be light weaving anyways as a healer. I just personally find that it's not really all that necessary. It's actually very easy to heal through damage in this game, so I don't find that I need additional healing from Lotus Blossom very often. Then we have Nature's Grasp. Both of them have their own benefits, but typically speaking, you'll be running Bursting Vines instead. Bursting Vines is essentially a very decent burst heal for one person, but it also grants 10 ultimate to you if you heal somebody who's under a certain health threshold, 60% health. So this can help you get faster Warhorn up times. Now with Bursting Vines, you will be moving around to whoever you happen to target with the ability, so you will have to keep that in mind here. Generally speaking, I personally don't find it to be very useful. The ultimate gain is nice, but you don't really need it all too much. So it's kind of up to you how you want to use this ability or not. The alternative would be to run something like Nature's Embrace, which is a heal over time. You still get some ultimate, just not quite as much. You gain 3 rather than 10, and you only get the ultimate once the heal over time completely expires. And then under Winter's Embrace, there's not much here. You could run Northern Storm or Permafrost, which grants you and nearby allies major protection. It can be useful in certain fights where you just want the raw mitigation, because this does stack with major maim that is applied on the boss enemy or whatever enemies you happen to be dealing with. So the major protection can be useful in those scenarios where you need additional mitigation. For example, like Halls of Fabrication against the Assembly General and Execute. Under the weapons line, Destruction Staff line, you might want to pick up Crushing Shock as a ranged interrupt. Under the Resto Staff line, Radiating Regeneration is pretty decent in 4-man content because it hits 3 allies for that heal over time. Less useful in Trials just because you have more people to heal, but it still can be useful in Trials nonetheless. Then you have Steadfast Ward. I personally like the Healing Ward morph. You're going to be using this with the Black Rose Prison Restoration Staff more often than not. It provides a shield, and while the shield is up, it does heal the target. So it is fairly decent, and the shield does scale depending on how badly somebody is injured. So it's actually not that bad of just a raw healing ability, but typically speaking, again, you'll be running this with the Black Rose Prison Restoration Staff just because, again, like I mentioned earlier, it's very easy to heal through damage in this game. They don't really need any sort of additional healing abilities. You probably want to reserve those valuable ability slots for things that buff allies instead. If you ever need a shield, you can always run either Morph of Annulment, Damp Magic, or Hardest Magicka. It's up to you which one you want to run. If you're running Zens, make sure to run Consuming Trap. This does count towards the Zen dot. Under the Mage's Guild line, both Entropy, both morphs, and Scalding Rune also count towards Zens. So again, if you're the Martial Knowledge Zens healer, you might want to pick up both of these abilities here just in case you need some additional single target dots. Make sure to pick up all the abilities under the Undaunted skill tree. So we've already talked about Overflowing Altar. You have Shadow Silk for the Black Widow synergy, which is pretty beneficial. It's essentially free damage. There are going to be some strategies where you will need to taunt things, so make sure to pick up Inner Rage for those strategies. Bone Surge for the Spell Surge synergy, mainly to help with Lachesis and Alkosh uptime, but the Major Vitality can be beneficial in certain fights where you have healing debuffs like in Black Rose Prison or in Cloud Rest. And then we already covered Energy Orb as well. Finally, under the Alliance War line, if you need to purge things, make sure to run Efficient Purge. Blue Betty will only purge yourself, it doesn't purge the group. So if you need to purge the group, you need to run Efficient Purge. And you can also run Reviving Barrier as an ultimate as well, get the additional Magicka regen from the Magicka 8 passive, plus the shield itself can be very beneficial to help out group survivability. Obviously, you would be giving up running Warhorn, so you're going to be giving up some DPS in order to this ultimate. But that pretty much covers it for all the abilities that you might want to have as a healer. And again, if you are running Martial Knowledge Zens, you are going to need a couple of single target dots. Pressure Infection does count, as does Soul Trap, as well as your two major skilled abilities, Entropy and Scalding Rune. So you'll typically be running those 4 abilities, plus you will be using something like a Poison Damage enchant in order to get the Poison status effect. So those would be finding their ways onto their bars if you're running Martial Knowledge Zens. Now, in terms of healing in ESO, those of you guys who are coming over from other MMOs might think of healers as essentially just healing through damage. While that is one of your primary jobs, your secondary job is just as important, and that is supporting your group DPS to help them do as much damage as possible. DPS in this game typically run about the health that you see here, so about 17k pre-buff, which ends up being anywhere between 18 to 20k post-buff, so that would be things like minor toughness and so on. Evident things like that. So the damage that your DPS will typically be taking will range usually anywhere between 5k to 10k. They typically will not be taking big damage hits. That really depends on the specific trial, the specific boss, but usually DPS are not going to be taking damage that you cannot necessarily heal through with your HOTS being layered down. If we just take a look at our just two heal over time abilities, let's take a look at Energy Orb and Illustrious Healing. So this is pre-buff, so this is before we have things like Major Sorcery, Major Courage, things like that. So with all those buffs in place, we'd probably be hitting about 2k health minimum per tick here with Illustrious Healing, and probably around 1100 per every half second, so about 2200 per second here. Combine together and you get about 4.2k healing done per tick if you have Energy Orb and Illustrious Healing out at the same time. This is also ignoring things like minor lifesteal and the passive health regen that DPS will obviously be having, and other abilities you might have on hand, like Budding Seeds, for example. So if you think about it, if we have all these things ticking at the same time, you're healing around 5 to 6k per second, and that's plenty to get through most damage. Burst damage is not really that big of a deal for DPS. It's obviously more of an issue for tanks, and that's why you have your burst heals like Comet Prayer and Enchanted Growth to help heal your tanks through those burst damages. But even then, the heal over time ticks that you have with 2 healers is typically enough to heal your tank up to full after 1 or 2 seconds of your HOTS ticking. So it's actually very easy to fulfill your first requirement as a healer, which is to keep everybody alive, as long as you're able to keep all of your HOTS layered down. Your second job, supporting group DPS to help them do more damage, is just as important, because the faster something dies, the less healing you have to do. So your second role does play into your first role a little bit here. Now, a lot of the abilities do count for both. So for example, Comet Prayer counts as a burst heal, but it also provides a Banner Berserk, which increases damage done by 8%. So you're fulfilling both roles here. You're fulfilling both your healing and you're buffing your overall group DPS by using Combat Prayer. And it's the same thing for a lot of these abilities. For example, Illustrious Healing, when you combine it with the Master's Restoration Staff, returns resources, which helps out your DPS sustain the light attack rotation. They don't have to do as many heavy attacks. So it's actually, you will actually find that it's very easy to fulfill both roles. Not to mention that you also have sets that you're wearing that will also help out with this group DPS support. Things like Olorime to provide Major Courage, Hollowfang, Worm to help sustain for Magicka DPS troops, etc. So the healer, once you kind of learn to fight and learn how to anticipate damage and learn how to layer your HOTS, then you want to shift over towards focusing on debuff and buff uptimes in order to maximize group DPS support. The hallmark of a really great healer in ESO isn't how much they're able to heal, how much healing done they can do. It's more about their buff and debuff uptimes. Really powerful and great healers are able to maintain close to full uptime on a lot of these debuffs and buffs in order to provide the most amount of damage possible for your group. Now, Warden healers in particular have a lot of buffs that other classes aren't really able to provide. For example, minor intellect and minor endurance. This is a pretty decent sustain buff. It's not going to make a huge difference, but your DPS will feel it over longer durations. 10% additional regen is not necessarily something to completely ignore, no matter how small it might feel. And of course, you're also providing things like Major Resolve to everybody, so that improves overall group survivability. Your unique class buff is Minor Toughness, which increases group health by 10%. So you're obviously increasing group survivability that way by increasing health in general. Then you have Fetcher Infection, which is going to be the most consistent source of minor vulnerability. So while there are other sources of minor vulnerability, Fetcher Infection is definitely going to be one of the most consistent ways. The other way, obviously, being the Nightblade's Lotus Fan ability. So Fetcher Infection with the minor vulnerability is really consistent and probably one of the better ways to get minor vulnerability out onto the boss that way. Warden healers also have Major Mending as well in their toolkit through one of their passives on the balance line. So it's accelerated growth here. It does have the condition that you need to heal somebody who's under 40% health, but you do have a source of Major Mending, which not all classes have access to. So your healing power is actually pretty decent here, especially when you consider that you have Emerald Moss, which increases healing done with your Green Balance abilities, which would be Budding Seeds and Enchanted Growth here for each one that you have slotted. So overall, Warden healers are pretty decent. They have a lot of tools that they can use to help support the group, as well as increase their own healing output, which is why you'll see Warden healers being used quite often in endgame content. So I might have a couple of Warden healer videos out on my streams archive, but in the description below I do have links to other content creators that do play healers full-time, and they should have Warden healer videos out on their respective channels or Twitch streams. So I highly recommend checking out those guys if you are interested in seeing how a Warden healer plays in endgame PvE content. Now, the best way to learn, after all, is to watch somebody play the spec that you intend on working with. Well, that pretty much concludes this build video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you guys have any questions at all, feel free to leave them down in the comment section below. I'll try to answer them all to the best of my ability. Again, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.